It's Emily OFC Podfic. Flashpoint. Written by It's Emily OFC. Read by It's Emily OFC. Chapter 11. A lot of firefighters would tell you that the 24-hour shifts were a grueling sacrifice. That was probably true for some, especially those raising families, but Tenzō felt exactly the opposite. The Wilmington Fire Department followed the standard 24 on, 48 off schedule for its firefighting crews. Tenzō quite enjoyed getting all of his work hours in at once and then having 2 days of leisure. It was even better when those 2 days didn't line up with a weekend. Tenzō wasn't a fan of crowds. He was still getting to know this city he had relocated to, and it was much easier to explore it when it wasn't bustling as it always was on the weekends. Having an entire Monday and Tuesday off was ideal to allow him time to traverse downtown Wilmington and acquaint himself with the many different businesses there. Today, Tenzō was walking the streets unhurriedly, just taking in the scenery. He enjoyed the architecture Wilmington had to offer, brick buildings and cobbled roads. The air always felt fresh, perhaps because of the proximity of the coast, and he didn't mind the cold at all. Tenzō didn't know where he'd been born. The records from his infancy and early childhood were spotty and unclear, but he felt comfortable here on the East Coast, acclimated. And he wondered if perhaps he was from somewhere like this, with narrow streets and high-peaked roofs trimmed with glistening icicles. He hadn't picked Wilmington or Delaware for any particular reason. Quite the opposite, actually. He had picked the furthest city from Denver that was actively hiring, submitting his application for transfer as soon as the discomfort at his old station had become unbearable. There had been many issues with the leadership at his station in Colorado, but once it was coupled with the palpable awkwardness and disapproval of his crewmates after he'd played his cards and lost, he'd known he had to get away. So he'd been lucky, really, that he'd ended up somewhere he was growing fond of, and lucky also that he liked his crew. Well, he liked them now. He supposed it was really Kakashi he should be thankful for. And he was. A bell jingled above his head as Tenzō pressed open the door to a small cafe. It was nearly lunchtime now, and he'd yet to have anything to eat. The smell of baked goods wafting from the door to the building as someone exited had inspired him to stop in. There was only one person ahead of Tenzō at the ordering counter, and as he waited his turn, he wondered if they might still have any seasonal holiday flavorings available for their coffee. It was March already, and the holidays were long since past, but it was not quite 20 degrees outside, and a peppermint latte seemed like it would fit the bill nicely. Tenzō occupied himself by surveying the interior of the cafe. It looked to be a charming establishment, tastefully decorated and well adorned with many indoor plants. It was fairly empty, with just a few college-looking types huddled around various corners, their headphones and laptop screens successfully sequestering them away from the outside world. He thought it might be a good place to relax for a while and resolved to find himself a seat by the windows once he'd ordered. Perhaps he'd catch up on one of the ebooks that was downloaded onto his phone. Just as the patron in front of Tenzō was paying for their order, the sound of the front door's bells rang out again as someone entered. "Fortune is on our side! There are many available tables!" A man's voice boomed from behind Tenzō. Tenzō turned around in surprise. The volume this person was speaking at could not have been less appropriate for the small, serene cafe. Standing at the open door was a tall, broad man, unmissable in his vibrant green and orange tracksuit and supporting the bluntest, shiniest bowl cut Tenzō had ever personally witnessed. He had such an arresting look, that it took Tenzō a full 3 seconds to realize that the man was linked arm in arm with none other than Kakashi, who still had 1 foot outside the building and whose expression was one of exasperation. Kakashi? Tenzō hadn't meant to say it out loud, but he heard his own voice call out anyway. His lieutenant looked different. Tenzō hadn't seen him in anything other than the department casual and full uniform since the holiday party so many months ago. Now Kakashi was in front of him in a thick woolen green sweater, a black bomber jacket, a pair of jeans cuffed at the ankle, and white sneakers. It was bizarre. It was like seeing your teacher outside of school and also realizing that that teacher was even hotter than you'd thought before. Suddenly, Tenzō wished he'd put in more effort than a flannel and a puffer jacket. Tenzō? Kakashi looked even more surprised to see him, eyes comically wide in what was hard not to interpret as horror, and Tenzō felt very caught off guard by how readable his expression was. So this is Tenzō. Even more good fortune. The man pulling Kakashi through the door made eye contact with Tenzō, smiling broadly. You must join us for lunch. Tenzō had barely recovered from seeing Kakashi outside of the station, and now he was being asked to sit with him and this strange man for lunch. Oh, I don't know, he answered unsurely, eyes flitting between Kakashi and the smiling man. Just who was this person? It seemed rude to decline, but Kakashi still looked like a deer in headlights, and Tenzō wasn't sure if that was a sign that he wanted Tenzō to say no or not. I insist, the man shouted. I will select the table. Kakashi, you will order the food, the man announced before releasing Kakashi's arm and traipsing off into the dining portion of the cafe. Tenzō watched him for a second longer before turning back to Kakashi. His lieutenant's expression had softened some, and now he looked resigned as he watched his friend go about selecting a table for the 3 of them. Sir? Tenzō's attention was coaxed back to the cafe's ordering counter where the barista who had called out was waiting expectantly for him to approach. Sorry, Tenzō apologized quickly as he closed the distance between himself and the counter. I'll just have a vanilla latte and a blueberry muffin. He didn't have the mental bandwidth to ask about seasonal flavors anymore. After paying, Tenzō stepped to the side to allow Kakashi to order, but Kakashi motioned to the barista that he needed a moment and instead stepped out of line to approach Tenzō. Hey, Kakashi said, one hand on the back of his neck. Kakashi looked good in the department issue navy, but damn if forest green wasn't his color. Hi, Tenzō replied, suddenly unclear on what he typically did with his hands, placing them momentarily on his hips and then crossing his arms instead. You don't have to sit with us if you don't want to, Kakashi said, glancing briefly at the table his friend had selected. The green-clad man was waving enthusiastically at them. Oh, Tenzō answered, still feeling a bit lost as to what to do. If you don't want me to, that's fine, he said. No, Kakashi was quick to respond. That's not it. I just mean, don't feel obligated to. That's all. Tenzō hesitated. It was impossible to tell whether Kakashi really wanted him to stay or not. Of course he'd never say he didn't want Tenzō at the table after he'd been invited, but it would be strange now if Tenzō declined, he thought. I'm still new in town, he answered finally. It's good to meet new people. Kakashi seemed to search his eyes for authenticity before nodding. Okay, he said. I'll meet you over there. Tenzō tried looking anywhere and everywhere but at Kakashi's friend as he approached the table, chiefly because he could tell the man was attempting to make zealous eye contact with him. Once he reached the table and perched himself on one of the chairs, though, he had to relent and meet the other man's gaze. It was a very intense gaze, accented not least by a set of dark, thick, rectangular eyebrows the same glossy black as his tablemate's hair. If Tenzō had been asked to imagine what one of Kakashi's friends might look like, this guy would have been the exact opposite of the image he would have conjured. "I am very excited to meet you," the man told him. "Kakashi has told me so much about you." Tenzō had not been expecting that, and he felt his face heat up in response. He hadn't yet had a chance to really digest the fact that the man had recognized his name when Kakashi had said it. Who was this person that Kakashi had been talking about him to? And what had Kakashi been saying about him? He thought of the way the two of them had entered the cafe, arm in arm. Could this be Kakashi's significant other? "That's, good to hear," Tenzō said. "And you are—" "My goodness!" the man exclaimed. "Where are my manners? I am Guy. I work with Kakashi at Station 15. Tenzō saw a young man seated several tables back raise an eyebrow while lifting one side of his headphones at the volume of Guy's voice. Tenzō's brain filed the information he'd been given away quickly and, whether he'd meant to or not, he deduced that Kakashi and Guy could not be dating, if this were the case, because Guy would be Kakashi's subordinate. There was no denying the feeling like a vice loosening its grip around his heart at the news. Kakashi appeared at the table's edge then, setting down a carrier of drinks and a tray of food. He had grabbed Tenzō's order as well, which he likely hadn't heard being called out over Guy's shouting. "Oh, thank you," Tenzō said as he reached for his items, placing them on the table in front of him. "I haven't said anything I shouldn't have," Guy informed Kakashi, who was settling into his own chair at the table. "The whole cafe knows what you have and haven't said," Kakashi replied, lifting his mug of coffee to his lips and blowing on it to cool it down. "Ah, yes," Guy responded, suddenly far, far more quietly. "The inside voice. Thank you for the reminder." Kakashi tilted his head slightly in acknowledgement. Tenzō let his shoulders relax a little more, grateful for the decrease in volume. "I was only telling dear Tenzō how you seem to talk of nothing else but him," Guy said, flashing a wink at Tenzō before biting off a large portion of his bagel sandwich. Tenzō felt the heat in his cheeks blaze hotter still, and he lifted his own mug, taking a sip of a latte that was still far too hot to drink to avoid having to respond. He risked a lightning-quick glance at Kakashi, and though his expression was composed, his skin had betrayed him, flushing from his neck all the way up to the tips of his ears. Tenzō probably should have counted that as a good sign, but he was far too busy being mortified. "I don't know if I'd put it quite like that," Kakashi mumbled, focusing his attention on his plate, where he was idly picking at a croissant. An awkward silence enveloped them then. Well, awkward for Tenzō and probably for Kakashi at least. Guy, for his part, continued to devour his sandwich happily, smiling between bites as he looked from Tenzō to Kakashi, then back to Tenzō again. "I hope I'm not interrupting your lunch date," Tenzō said, trying to fill the silence, taking another sip of his coffee. "It's not a date." Kakashi's response was swift and merciful. Tenzō may have been fishing a little bit, after all. "Nonsense," Guy insisted. "Kakashi and I did not even have plans. I simply happened across him, just as I have happened across you. It is all very fortuitous." "Oh?" Tenzō asked politely. "Yes. I came across Kakashi engaged in one of his bad habits." Guy's smile, which had until this moment been ever-present, was interrupted by a disapproving frown tossed in Kakashi's direction for just a moment. He was standing outside the remains of a bookstore that had burned down, simply staring at it. Tenzō knew which bookstore it had to be. His crew had handled the call-out some months ago, and he remembered Kakashi's reaction to the news when he'd told him about it. "As his colleague and his rival, I, of course, had an obligation to cheer him up," Guy continued. Tenzō tilted his head. "Rival?" he asked, genuinely curious. And when he looked to Kakashi for confirmation, his cheeks had faded to just a light rosy color, and he raised his eyebrows at Tenzō, neither confirming nor denying the claim. "Yes," Guy asserted. "Kakashi has long been my professional rival, though I would be remiss not to say that I have yet to beat him at anything. He is too quick, impossible to catch off guard, though one day I am confident I will succeed." Tenzō nodded as though he understood, though he hardly did. It wasn't surprising to hear that Kakashi had the reputation of being top tier at his normal station. If he didn't, Tenzō doubted he would have been left to run Station 10 without a captain present. Although, as near perfect as Kakashi was at his job, Tenzō's crew, to their credit, had found flaws, whether they had been exposed intentionally or not. There was, of course, the infamous Make-Out Paradise book and its many unsavory scenes, which were now easily quotable even by Tenzō for how often they were repeated around the firehouse. But there was also something else the crew had discovered recently. "Have you tried dogs?" Tenzō asked Guy, and he tried to use a swig of his latte to cover his grin as he saw Kakashi's head jerk up at the question. "I beg your pardon?" Guy asked, expression quizzical. "If you're looking for a way to distract Kakashi so that you can get ahead, dogs seem to work," Tenzō continued, watching in amusement as Guy's eyes widened with interest. "All we have to do to get Kakashi to forget what he was doing at Station 10 is call in Sparky, our Dalmatian." "Is this true, Kakashi?" Guy asked, regarding his teammate with an expression of incredulity. Kakashi scoffed. "Of course not." "Last week," Tenzō objected, earning Guy's rapt attention again, "he was right in the middle of assigning the next round of hydrant inspections, and our engineer whistled for Sparky. Kakashi stopped to pet her and never picked the conversation back up. Totally forgot about it." Tenzō gave Kakashi a matter-of-fact look as he popped the last of his muffin into his mouth, daring him to disagree. Kakashi didn't argue. Instead, he furrowed his brow and looked away for a moment before realization dawned on his features and his eyes shifted back to Tenzō's. "Oh my God, you're right. I still haven't assigned the next round." "See?" Tenzō said to Guy with a satisfied grin. He looked impressed. "Wait," Kakashi interrupted. "This is a thing you all are doing on purpose?" Tenzō held his hands up in self-defense. "Hey, I haven't done anything," he contended. "Except for not telling me it was happening," Kakashi accused. At this, Guy burst into a bout of laughter. It was so joyous and carefree that it was infectious, and suddenly all three of them were chuckling, probably each of them at something different. For Tenzō's part, he was laughing at himself for being so nervous about seeing Kakashi outside of work. He was the same man. They had the same rapport. It had been his own anxiety that had made things awkward in the first place, and as strange as Guy was, he made for an excellent conversation partner. Guy's large hand came to rest on Kakashi's shoulder as his laughter ebbed. "I like him," he told Kakashi. "He is just as wonderful as you said." Kakashi's cheeks were scarlet again, and Tenzō knew he must look the same, but this time he just grinned at his lieutenant, accepting the praise proudly. Tenzō was nervous, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. It had only been yesterday that he'd been seated at that small cafe table, Guy across from him and Kakashi to his left, as they'd whiled away more than 2 hours in pleasant conversation. By the end of it, he'd been at ease, comfortable. So why now, back at the station, was he all jitters and trepidation at having been asked to join Kakashi in his office? He'd been right in the middle of loading the dishwasher in the station's kitchen when Kakashi had made the request, and so he'd had a few minutes to steepen his nerves as he finished the task and made his way down the hall. The best explanation that he could come up with was that this was perhaps not nervousness, but excitement. He had the distinct feeling that a page of some sort, one that had been stubborn before, had been pried up and turned in that warm, unassuming coffee shop. Even his own cautionary history with mistaking someone's friendliness for romantic interest couldn't dissuade him from believing that Kakashi was attracted to him after what he had witnessed yesterday. Everything up until then could have been imagined or some kind of misunderstanding, but Tenzō wasn't completely inexperienced, and he'd been through enough relationships to know that you didn't turn beet red when accused of talking extensively about a potential friend. There were still so many unknowns, though. Even if Kakashi was interested, and Tenzō was sure that he was, that didn't change the fact that the two of them were in a reporting relationship. Sure, Kakashi would move back to his old station eventually, but who was to say that that would mean he'd want to start seeing Tenzō? Who was to say that Kakashi was interested in anything at all beyond the friendly banter they already had, which Tenzō could now identify more clearly as flirting? It must have been this uncertainty that was making Tenzō's pulse race and his mouth feel dry as he entered the captain's office. Kakashi wasn't seated behind the captain's desk as he had always been before when Tenzō had been in the office. This time he was in front of it, leaning back against it, apparently absorbed in the contents of a document he held in one hand, the other hand placed thoughtfully on his chin. There was no telling if Kakashi was interested in anything more with Tenzō, but there was no doubt in Tenzō's mind what he was interested in. His worry over being mistaken had prevented him from allowing himself to dwell on his crush much at all before yesterday, but now it was as if his imagination was on spring break. Tenzō's fingers twitched at his side. In his mind's eye, he could see himself taking the few steps needed to close the gap between himself and Kakashi. The palm of one hand finding a resting place at Kakashi's hip, and the digits of the other closing around the document in his lieutenant's hands, prizing it from his grasp and tossing it onto the desk, out of the way. Kakashi's now free right hand would curl around to capture Tenzō by the back of the neck, and he'd lean down, tilting his head just slightly until... "Oh, Tenzō, sorry, I didn't see you come in." Tenzō was returned abruptly to the present reality by Kakashi's greeting, and was surprised to find that he'd unconsciously taken one step forward. He immediately shifted his weight onto his back foot, returning the one that had quite literally stepped out of line back to meet it. "No worries," Tenzō responded, hoping the images that had just been in his mind weren't somehow visible on his face. "Have a seat," Kakashi suggested as he retreated back around the desk to his own chair. Tenzō pulled a chair away from the wall of the room and toward the desk before sitting down into it. The captain's office was virtually unrecognizable as the same one Jiraiya had left 2 months prior. Kakashi's work had paid off. Gone were the stacks of paper and piles of junk. The captain's office was now pristine, the glossy desk surface graced with nothing more than a computer monitor, a keyboard, a mouse, and the thick, stapled document Kakashi had been reading moments prior. "I'm sorry about yesterday," Kakashi said, folding his hands neatly on top of the document. "About Guy." He looked a little sheepish. Tenzō shook his head. "I liked Guy," he replied honestly. "I actually had a really good time." Kakashi broke into a small smile at his words, and Tenzō guessed that it was what he had been hoping to hear, that he had just been testing the waters. "Me too," Kakashi admitted, and his eyes seemed to shift back and forth, looking into each of Tenzō's one at a time. "We should do it again sometime, just the two of us." The words were on the tip of Tenzō's tongue, but he kept them to himself. There wasn't a more inappropriate place to say them than where they were right now, separated by a bulky, physical reminder of their reporting relationship. "Is that what you called me in here to say?" he asked instead, a teasing tone in his voice. Kakashi's smile grew. "No," he said. "I was actually wondering if you had any interest in heading up a project." Tenzō crossed one ankle over a knee and sat back. "A project?" Kakashi spun the document on the desk around and slid it forward until it was in front of Tenzō.
Department leadership is considering a proposal to make helmet cams part of the standard pack-out like radios. They know the move would be controversial, and they want to get a pulse on how it will impact culture, so they've asked each station for feedback before going forward with the proposal.
Tenzō picked the proposal up. It was flipped several pages in, and the section Kakashi had apparently been reviewing when he'd entered the room was a set of data visualizations pertaining to training material retention for training using diagrams versus training using helmet cam footage.
I don't want to phone this one in. If anyone knows that culture at a station is precarious, it's us. Helmet cams could be valuable as training tools, and God knows law enforcement would love the footage, but if people feel like it would be used against them, implementation will be a disaster.
Kakashi continued. Tenzō nodded along. Everything Kakashi was saying was true. There was no doubt that the topic would be controversial as hell. "So what do you need from me?" he asked.
"I was hoping you could talk to the crew and get their feedback. I worry that if I do it, they won't be honest. I thought maybe you could talk with each one of them, and then you could share their insights with me so that I could put it in the report for Captain Senju."
Tenzō flipped through a few more pages, not really gleaning much from what he was seeing. He thought of Anko and her tendency to believe that everything was a personal affront to her. He thought of Kotetsu and Izumo, and how tenuous their confidence was. Tenzō bit the inside of his lip. "This is going to be touchy," he said. Kakashi smiled widely at him, and something that felt larger than butterflies flapped about in Tenzō's stomach.
"I know," Kakashi said. "That's why I think you're the best man for the job."
"Why were you standing outside the burned-down bookstore?" Tenzō had wanted to ask the question many times over the past 2 weeks, but it had felt too invasive. He could hardly believe that it had already been that long since Kakashi had assigned him the helmet cam project, but 5 shifts in the days between had passed in what seemed like a blur to Tenzō. Perhaps it was because they'd been busy. For whatever reason, Station 10 had been bogged down with what felt like endless call-outs lately. Nothing unusual or particularly harrowing, just an excess of small, no-injury blazes that kept them on the go all day long. It had made it difficult for Tenzō to find time to meet with his teammates, but he'd fit in time with them whenever he'd been able to find it, being sure to ask questions as openly as possible, collecting their true, candid feedback on the proposal. After the 3rd time he'd found Kakashi brooding under the pendant light at the kitchen island, late into the evening, Tenzō had come to realize that it was now a habit for his lieutenant, and he'd made a point to adopt the habit as well. He liked the chance to talk to Kakashi away from the hustle and bustle of the workday, and he'd been using the time as an opportunity to debrief Kakashi on the preliminary feedback from the crew. It was all business talk, but the lateness of the hour, the warm lighting, and the atmosphere of seclusion made it feel like something else. Tonight, Tenzō had finished walking Kakashi through Asuma's very complicated thoughts on helmet cameras. He had been the last person Tenzō needed to speak with on the matter, and, as Tenzō expected, he had not been shy about his feelings. Kakashi had listened to Tenzō paraphrase the engineer's perspective with his chin resting on his palm, his elbow propped up on the counter. There was no need for him to take any notes. Part of Tenzō's project would be to provide a written summary. They discussed Asuma's contributions briefly, but now there was nothing left to talk about. No more work conversation to be had. And so, after a few moments of amicable silence, Tenzō had breached the line and asked the question about the thing that had been on his mind ever since it had fallen from Guy's lips. Kakashi, to his credit, didn't seem surprised by the shift in topic. He merely hummed, adjusting his posture in his seat a bit, his knee bumping Tenzō's under the counter in the process. Had they always sat this close before?
"I don't like it when there isn't an explanation for something," Kakashi answered after a pause. He pursed his lips. "It's a bad habit, but sometimes I go back, just to see if I can find anything I missed."
"For arson cases?" Tenzō asked, furrowing his brow as he tried to unpack the logic.
"Not just arsons," Kakashi answered.
voice now seeming to have a trace of discomfort. He averted his gaze, and the slight change in angle made the faint pink scar that bisected his somehow undamaged eye, something Tenzō had only noticed recently and didn't know the story behind, shine as it caught on a beam of light from the pendant lamp above.
Anytime there isn't an explanation for a fire, I just want it to make sense. I know that's not our job, but I always have this feeling that if I go back, maybe I can find some missing piece.
By the end of this explanation, Kakashi's demeanor had changed noticeably. He was still facing away from Tenzō. His hand had curled into a frustrated fist on the counter. Tenzō could tell in the soft light that his jaw was clenched. "Has it ever worked?" he asked, honestly curious. "Have you ever found anything?" Kakashi's fist released at Tenzō's question, and he tapped his fingers on the quartz as he let out a sigh, shoulders sagging a bit.
"No,"
he answered. Kakashi's body language was like an open book to Tenzō. He could sense the way this answer made Kakashi feel, foolish, disappointed, aggravated. Tenzō regretted bringing the topic up. He hadn't meant to sour the conversation. "Maybe there's nothing to find," he suggested, hoping to smooth things over. "Maybe it's not that you can't find it. Maybe it just isn't there." Kakashi tapped his fingers on the counter 2 more times before turning his head to meet Tenzō's gaze again. His stare was arresting, and his eyes seemed to shine with intent. He said nothing at first, just staring straight into Tenzō's eyes so calculatingly that Tenzō was worried he might be reading all of his thoughts.
"Things don't just catch fire, Tenzō," Kakashi said finally. "Something has to cause a spark."
Tenzō's breath caught in his throat. Kakashi's voice had been low when he spoke, and the words and their sound had the effect of a crackle of lightning between them. Tenzō got the impression they weren't talking about literal fires anymore, and Kakashi's continued eye contact felt like a challenge. A dare. Tenzō's heart was in his throat, and he could feel the slightest tremor in his fingers as he lifted his hand. But he took the leap anyway, placing it firmly on Kakashi's knee, fighting to keep a neutral expression as he continued to meet the other man's gaze. 4 long, loud tones rang out from above. Engine 3. Structure fire. East 29th Street and Carter Street. It's Emily OFC Podfic.